I'd first off just like to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm incredibly humbled that I am the recipient of this award. I unfortunately never got the chance to meet David Swanson, but from everything I've been able to hear, he was just an incredible person, and like I said, I'm just honored to be able to present my research to carry on his memory. Uh, with that, uh, thank you, Rhonda, for the wonderful introduction. My name's Connor Natzke. I'm a PhD student at Colorado School of Mines, and right now I'm stationed in Vancouver, British Columbia, and working at Triumph, which is a particle physics laboratory right around UBC, if anybody's ever been to the area. And my research with the OSG has been investigating the strong nuclear force. So a bit of background, so we can all get on the same page. There are four fundamental forces in nature: gravity, electromagnetic, strong, and weak. Hopefully we're all familiar with gravity. It's the force that keeps us on this planet, and it's really the force that works on large mass scales and large distance scales, and it's, simply put, it's what binds the solar system together. It allows everything to continue orbiting and not just fly around and crash into everything. Then on smaller length scales, we have the electromagnetic force, which is what allows positive and negative charges to be attracted, and similarly, positive and negative magnetic poles to be attracted. And this is the force that binds atoms together. It's what keeps the electrons, negatively charged electrons, orbiting the positively charged nucleus, or the center of the atom. Now we go to even smaller length scales, and we see the strong force, which is it's named a strong force. It's a very strong force that works on very small length scales, but this is actually what binds the nucleus together. This is the force that keeps the protons and neutrons bounded and in as a cohesive unit, essentially. And then we have what's called the weak force. The weak force is a bit more complicated to explain, and it's a little more nebulous, but it deals with radioactive decay, forces involved in the specifically beta decay, which is the emission of electron. But the focus of this talk and this work is the strong force. So once again, this is what binds the protons and neutrons together in the center of an atom. When we want to look at something very small, we need to use, in order to see it, we need to use a microscope, essentially. And it's a general rule that the smaller something is, the larger the microscope needs to be in order to see it. So if you recall back to high school, early college days in a biology lab, and you want to look at the cells of a plant, you use a tabletop microscope. It's the standard. You see it everywhere in media, scientists in a lab coat looking through a few lenses. But now say you want to look at what makes up that cell, or maybe even down to the atomic scale itself. So see the atoms that make up that cell. You need something accordingly bigger. You need an electron microscope, which is now the size of a large filing cabinet, or half of a room, so on and so forth. Now, you actually want to see even smaller than that and see inside the nucleus itself. So in the center of the atom, you need an even bigger microscope. And the images I have on screen are one such apparatus. This is a large-scale gamma ray detection array called Griffin, housed at Triumph. The acronym is the Gamma Ray Infrastructure for Fundamental Investigations of Nuclei. Not entirely important for the content of this talk, but nice to know. And to reference its size, I'm about 6 foot tall, and my head comes up to, can you see my mouse, by the way?
Yes.
Regardless.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So my head comes up to right about here. So this is a 10-foot tall array. It's large, but we need a large microscope enabled in order to see something so small. What we are interested in looking at is radiation emitted from unstable atomic nuclei. And a nice property of radiation is it carries information about the internal structure of that nucleus. So schematically, the focus of this work is what's called gamma-gamma angular correlations. And what that means is you have an atomic nucleus sitting in the center of that big microscope, that big detection array, like I just mentioned, and it's in an energetic site, it's unstable. So in order to de-excite and become more stable, it releases two photons, photon 1 and photon 2, with some angle in between them. The array, then, with two different detectors, we can measure, we can basically see those photons. That's how we're gaining information about the radioactive decay. For reference, one of these detectors are one of these big red pieces in the array. What information this provides us is the angle in between these two detected photons carries information about the angular momentum of the nucleus. So this is related to the structure internally. And it's a very important piece of information for nuclear structure. Unfortunately, our detectors exist in the real world and are not perfectly small, and infinitely efficient. So we have to create correction factors that will allow us to reconstruct this angle between photons to a greater degree. These correction factors come from simulation, and they're dependent on the energy of the two photons. So photon 1 and photon 2 have different energies. The correction factor is dependent on both of those, and it's also dependent on the physical arrangement of the array. So as these detectors, maybe you have an arrangement where they're a little bit closer to the nucleus than the previous experiment, or a little bit farther. Those are different corrections. What this amounts to is we have to map a large parameter space in order to find these corrective factors, like I said, to be able to reconstruct what that angle between the detected photons is. This work has been done by a Monte Carlo simulation package called GEONT4, and the image on the right is actually this correction factor surface for a specific detector arrangement that had been completed previously. So on the X and the Y axis, this is the energy axis. So X is the energy of photon 1, Y is the energy of photon 2, and then the Z axis here is the corrective factor. So if I measure a decay energy 1, energy 2, I know what those energies are. I can pull up this surface, look and go, oh, that's what the corrective factor I need is for my detectors. This, like I said, this is specific to an arrangement of the array itself. The more current experiments we're running have a different arrangement than the surface was fitted for. So we need to create a new one. And to map that surface, we need 41 different points. So that's 41 different combinations of energy. Each point requires 3 simulations, and each of those simulations require 1 billion events. And each one of those simulations is about, so 1 billion events takes about 400 CPU hours per simulation. Adding all this together, we find it takes about 50,000 CPU hours to map this surface, and that amounts to about 5.7 years. That's a lot longer than I'm willing to spend in a PhD, so standard computation does not fit. It becomes a very difficult problem with standard computation. I should mention too that you can find these correction factors for the detectors just by running a single simulation of the two energies of interest at the distance. So what the surface is, it's a more general solution, so we don't have to keep running, simulation upon simulation upon simulation. You map the surface once, and then for all future arrangements matching that physical arrangement of the detectors, you can look up the corrective factor without actually needing to run a different simulation. That'll be important here in a bit. So like I said, standard computation, this quickly becomes an intractable project. Luckily, like Rhonda mentioned, I attended the OSG user school in 2019 and learned that Monte Carlo simulations are essentially the poster child for distributed high throughput computing. They have this wonderful property that one simulation of one billion events is identically equal to 1,000 simulations of 1 million events, which is identically equal to 1 million simulations of 1,000 events. This allows the simulation and the simulation campaign to be easily adapted to distributed high throughput. You can just break it up in smaller pieces, send it off to different execute nodes. They do their work, send it all back, you add it all together. It's exactly the same. It's frankly beautiful how easily this works. So on this screen here, this graphic shows the basic workflow that I started with. The orange circles here are occurring on execute nodes. So I input some parameters to the program. It sends it off to a node. Simulation runs, takes about an hour to run the simulation. Then a file gets transferred back to the submit node, this output file, which then that output file then gets submitted to another execute node for a different program that basically converts that output into something a bit more readable and a bit more usable in our analysis software. So then we get another output file. Then that file goes through a third validation stage to make sure the simulation ran correctly, all the events are there, there's nothing missing. And once that passes, it then gets sent off outside of the OSG to our analysis server. Each one of these small workflows gets run 1,000 times. So this is the 1,000 simulations of 1 million events. And then that whole process is then iterated again 3 times, because if you remember, it takes 3 different simulations to map one point on that surface. DAGMAN was my first approach at this, and DAGMAN handled the workflow a lot of, so I don't have to actually submit every single job, which is, wonderful. And to make it more automated, I wrote a few Python scripts that create the DAG file, submit it, handle a lot of just the beginning work for this. And in total, for one point, this this workflow took about 24 hours. So relatively quite quick. Prior to this, like I mentioned, that surface that was already mapped, each point took about 1 week. So I'm already seeing about 7 times faster. Downsides, jobs would fail randomly. So there would be bad file transfers. The simulation would hit sometimes it was like a seg fault in the simulation code. There was just some odd random failures. And all of this automation to catch that was reliant on my ability as a programmer, which there's always room for improvement. So, eventually I was spending more time trying to catch errors than I was running the simulation. And just by nature of how this workflow functioned, it created a large memory footprint on the submit node. Now I realize compared to other users, this is a relatively small memory footprint, but for my case, it was large. It was about 400 gigabytes. Digging into it, I found the common failure points were specific file transfers between the simulation and that conversion code. And going down the line, it basically happened at file transfer stages. And the vast majority of the runtime of this workflow happened in this final step of transferring the data out of OSG. So it worked great. I was mapping points, but then I attended the 2021 OSG All Hands Meeting and learned about Pegasus. So for anybody who doesn't know, Pegasus is a workflow manager that couples really nicely into OSG. And basically all that automation I wrote is written in a production value. It's much better and it's written by computer scientists rather than physicists masquerading as computer scientists. So wonderful things is those jobs that would fail randomly, there were catches that would retry them until they worked. I didn't have to do anything for that. I just told the system, if it fails, please rerun it until it doesn't. And all this automation was built in. So the file transfers, I didn't have to specify how they were transferring, when they were transferring, file cleanup. So once an intermediate file was done and I didn't need it anymore, Pegasus just deleted it, so I didn't have to worry about it. What this allowed me to do was create simpler inputs, so abstract it out a little bit further and build a little bit of automation on top of it that really simplified my inputs, and I'll explain those here in a few slides. And what this amounted to, nice benefit of this was a much smaller memory footprint on the submit node because of this file cleanup and automatic file transfers. The cost of this is the workflow became a bit more complicated. So don't worry about the specifics of this workflow. It's hard to read because the text is so small. But the basic idea is there is a single input file that has the input parameters, and then everything past that point, so the green circles down, is all handled by Pegasus internally. All I do is I pass it input parameters, and it does the rest. It creates, formats everything properly and transfers, and it really, really sped up my workflow. What took 24 hours now takes 4 hours. And that really allowed me to expand what could be done by mapping this surface. So I could, at the beginning of the morning, just input my parameters, hit enter, focus on whatever I needed to till lunch, go eat lunch, come back, and I had a point mapped that I can just repeat that as many times as needed. So it was really, really fast and really, really efficient. Furthermore, the error catching just made it so I was having less bad, there were fewer bad simulations, so I wouldn't have to rerun workflows. I don't think I've had to rerun a single Pegasus workflow, or sometimes I was having to rerun my DAGman workflows 3-4 times to make sure that all of the data actually came through. And like I said, I abstracted this so it became very, very easy to run. It actually only takes 3 command line calls. The first is modifying this input file, which has, so this G1 and G2 are just the 2 energies of interest. Then the rest are labeling for archiving purposes and just to keep track of what simulation is which. So I just change that input file, then run a small script I wrote to convert those inputs and format them correctly into the inputs that the workflow requires. Then I just call the workflow and go for a bike ride or write some more code for a different project. Come back and it's done. Everything's been transferred to the analysis server. Like I said, it's incredibly efficient. The net result is Pegasus and OSG has provided a more than 40 times increase in the simulation speed of this project. So like I mentioned before, that initial surface was mapped using poor man's multi-threading, I call it, which was multiple simulations submitted on a local cluster. So not just standard computational laptop. And that first surface that was already mapped, you only use 19 points. And each point took 168 hours per point, which is about 1 week per point. And everything had to be done manually. With the OSG workflow, I've now mapped 61 different points, and it only takes about 4 hours per point. So like I mentioned, that's more than a 40 times increase in simulation speed. And furthermore, it's less error prone because everything's handled automatically and checks and checksums and all the like. I'm still, every time I run this, I'm amazed at how much time I've saved and just the pure number of resources I have access to with the OSG. It's just mind-blowing to me. So I would love to be able to show you the fit surface that all these points feed into. But unfortunately, my focus and my priority shifted a bit, so I have not mapped the surface yet, but that is a relatively simple process compared to getting this workflow up and running. And it's simple enough that it's a Python script the mapping is just a Python script on a laptop. It doesn't actually need distributed computing. And also, I would love to be able to show you the titles of the publications that have come from this research, because like I mentioned before, just because I don't have the surface doesn't mean we can't use this data. Each of these 61 different points was a combination of 2 photons that required correction and I can just pass the direct simulation results to my colleagues who need that information. They can use the outputs of the simulation to find those correction factors ad hoc rather than in a general way. So that's not to say this workflow hasn't been completed. It's actually been very successful, but all the manuscripts are still being written. So I am not able to show you the nice publications that should be coming out within the next probably 6 months. And there's, I think, 3 or 4 in the works. The largest takeaway for me from this entire exercise is just how I've fundamentally changed my approach to expensive computational problems. As I mentioned before, this was a large problem, and previously it had just been done by setting your simulation, walking away for a week, coming back, and over the course of 6 months, you finally get your, map the surface and get your results. But with the OSG, it's really helped me break problems down into their smallest parts and figure out ways to run thousands of them at a time. And so you're only limited by the number of computational resources you have rather than time gated by the process itself. There's 2 or 3 other projects that or kind of workflows that I'm developing for use that follow a similar structure where it can be broken down into many small pieces and shipped out everywhere, and it's significantly faster. So really, this whole exercise has just changed how I approach these expensive computational problems. Rather than just brute forcing it, it's really nice to be able to step back and say, how can I break this up to fit a distributed high throughput computing infrastructure? That being said, and in addition to this, I've really taken advantage of what the OSG has had to offer. I've used 135,000 wall hours at this point, and that's 15 years of wall time. It's a number that still doesn't quite seem real to me based on how quickly I've gotten my results. And through this whole process, I've submitted close to 600,000 jobs. Quite a few. And again, for some of the members of this collaboration, it's a small number, but for a single PhD student, that's a significant number of jobs, in my opinion. This graph on the right kind of shows my usage over time. So in spring 2021, this is where I was mapping the vast majority of the points, and you can accordingly see the rise in wall hours. And then there's this break for about a year, which, like I said, unfortunately my priorities shifted, so I wasn't able to return to this project until recently. And through Pegasus and just the robustness of these OSG workflows, I didn't have to update anything. I didn't have to redo anything. All I did was change that input file, hit enter, and it ran just the same it did a year ago, which was surprising and really, really nice for me. So just once again, the greatest takeaway I have from working with the OSG is just the pure access to resources and the change in my change in thought process, how to approach these expensive computational problems. I couldn't have done any of this without extensive help from both OSG and Pegasus. In particular, I'd really like to thank Lauren and Mats for help. Lauren really helped me develop my DAGman workflow and got that up and running. And then when I switched over to Pegasus, I wish I could show the Slack channel that Mats and I were discussing. It was a lot of help, and I really appreciate it. So I'm incredibly grateful for both of them and everybody else who answered my questions in developing this process. I would love to be able to answer any questions you have and discuss anything more in detail. If you ever want to reach out to me and say hi or have questions, I have added my email to the bottom of this slide. So once again, thank you for this opportunity, and I'd love to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Connor. This was very nice. Any questions, anybody?
No question, but I sure enjoyed it, Connor. Thank you so much for being so down to earth with how you explained your work. I loved it.
Yeah, we have Ryan. Go ahead, Connor.
Oh, I would say I work very, I appreciate that compliment. I work very hard to try to make rather complicated physics approachable for everyone. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Ryan Fisher has his hand up. Can somebody let him, enable him to talk?
Hi, yeah, so I had one question. You mentioned that one of the early problems you had within your workflow that you had hand created was this issue when you're doing file transfers is where you often saw failures. When you switched over to Pegasus, now we're already using Pegasus, but we still see this happen a lot. Did you find that you still have those problems, but you're just automatically rerunning them because it automatically reruns them as Pegasus does? Or is it that you also reduced the number of those file transfers? I was curious what you saw.
Both, actually. So Pegasus would catch when a file did not transfer correctly, Pegasus would catch it and retry it, but it also reduced, it would cleverly bunch things. I'm not entirely sure what happens beneath the hood, but it would bunch things and ship them out in batches to decrease the number of file transfers. I forgot to mention kind of a funny story. At one point running this, I got a fun email from the IT department at my university that we saw on our analysis server a denial of service attack. So a DDoS attack. And it turns out it was because Pegasus was transferring so many files so quickly that I DDoSed our own analysis server and had to change some parameters so that didn't happen anymore. Just a rather funny story. But to answer your question, the biggest benefit of Pegasus was it just would automatically catch those failed transfers, retry them on a different node, and then it would work great.
Any other questions? Any questions to the entire session this morning? Tim. Richard Jones first, then Tim.
Okay.
Can somebody unmute Richard?
Yes, thank you. This is inspired by an earlier slide in the session where the access point to OSG was pictured in the middle of a hub with many different ways to vector out to resources from there. And one of those resources was PSC, which is one of the large national facilities, in addition to the existing network of HTC resources through OSG pool. And so suppose that you're in a collaboration where you have separate workflows, one going to these using allocated time on a national facility, and then another workflow going to the OSG pool. And this graphic suggests that those two could be unified, that there could be one workflow that makes use of both kinds of resources. Here's the question: if I have an allocation on one of the national facilities, how do I bring that in so that it can be used through an OSG access point? Or do I need to request a new path allocation? In other words, can I bring my allocation, or do I need to request a fresh path allocation?
You can bring your allocation. The idea of the model is to bring your own capacity. And what you need to do is to bring us the allocation number, and we will take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
And Tim, you had a question.
Mine was for Connor. Just I didn't find the raise hand button fast enough. So Connor, it sounds from your talk, what I understood is it sounds like you're running your workflow sort of one pair of energies at a time. Is there a reason why you do that sort of one at a time manually, or could you just sort of sweep over, combinations of energies in sort of that you lay out in advance?
That's a great question. The reason I do it one by one is a byproduct of that original Dagman workflow, in that I would submit one simulation or one combination of energies, occasionally would fail, and then after it transferred to the analysis server, I would do a double check to make sure everything looked right and I had the sufficient number of statistics. And occasionally I would have to rerun, like I said, rerun it 2 or 3 times. And when I transferred over to the Pegasus workflow, I guess I just never changed that. So more of a legacy consideration than a conscious choice. I could very easily adapt it to scan over a bunch of energies. I just haven't done so.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering if that's helpful to the underlying science, like to be able to just define a whole set of the combinations ahead of time and then just kind of walk away for a week and you get, you know, a lot, 20, 30 combinations done in a week or something like that.
That's highly dependent on the experiment itself. So each nucleus has certain energy levels in it, and generally those energy levels are unique to that nucleus. So some of my colleagues will say, hey, I measured, you know, energy 1 and energy 2. I'm interested in finding the angle between these 2 photons in my data set. Can you run a simulation for it? And then the next, you know, they maybe have 3 or 4 of those, but then a week later I get a different request for 3 or 4 different ones. We don't really know what those points are going to be until somebody starts to dig into their actual experimental data. And that's the purpose of mapping this general surface, so that I don't get constant requests to run simulations. I just map the surface once, and then people can plug it into a web tool and it'll bring up those correction factors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, if there are no other questions, I want to make one last comment before we go, break for lunch. I wanted to make a comment about David's legacy more general. In fact, if you look at, you've already seen this is in Brian's talk, and you'll see it more in other talks later. For example, mine on I forget, Wednesday, I think. And the UNL continues to be at the forefront of some of the most interesting things we do new in advancing the technology and so forth. And a large part of that is David's legacy. And I wanted to acknowledge that before we go for lunch, and therefore complete the session for this morning. Thank you, David.